Well, as part of our special Veterans Day broadcasting, military historian, U.S. Army veteran, and award winning author Mike Guardia is back on Big Blend Radio today, and he's joining us to talk about his brand new book. It's called Air War on the Eastern Front. And, check it out. It is all about when, way back in June 1941, Hitler decided to launch what's called Operation Barbarossa, a full scale invasion of the Soviet homeland. And I don't know. For me, I like you always think about World War II, and I always get right into Germany and France and Belgium
Mm-hmm.
and all those areas. But the Soviet side or the Russian side is really pretty interesting because that's almost like spurred it off. I'm saying I think because Mike will clear all of that up. Mike is our like military historian that comes on our shows all the time. He's also one of our experts in Big Blend Radio and TV magazine. And as Nancy and I travel the country, we find all this military history, and he comes on and talks about that too, especially in regards to generals. Mike is an author of a gazillion books, a ton of them, and this is his latest one. So check it out, Air War on the Eastern Front. It's out today, November 11th. So go get it on Amazon. Go to his website, MikeGuardia.com. So welcome back, Military Mike. How are you doing?
Hey, ladies, I'm doing great. It's great to be on the show, as always.
Thank you. So am I right? I've got to bring that up about, like, I forgot this whole Russian side, right, of World War II, which is, like, nuts. But, that's me. That kind of, like, in reading your book, it was like, wait a minute, this was something that was brewing for, 20 years?
Right. So here in the West, we typically tend to focus on what happened from the Western Allied side. I think there tends to be more focus and a little bit more publicity given to what the Americans and the British were doing against the Germans. And then, of course, you also have the other side of the coin, which focuses on operations in the Pacific. And I think comparatively speaking, the operations along the Eastern Front tends to get a little bit less attention than some of the other big-name operations throughout the war.
And so this is Operation Barbarossa, and so it was known as the Great Patriotic War, which is an interesting. We think about now, the word patriot is being used in so many ways now, but Operation Barbarossa. So that sounds like a wine label to me. Wine. But no, don't do that. But so this was something that Hitler, he was brewing this for a while, right? Like it was his intention for a while to say, hey, I'm going to go out there and get the Soviets next.
It was, and really, in order to get a good, clear picture as to what was happening, you really have to wind the clocks all the way back to the end of World War I, because that conflict, they called it the War to End All Wars, and it really did not end well either for the Russians or the Germans. For better or for worse, the Germans really got straddled with the burden of guilt for World War I at the Treaty of Versailles. And in many ways, it was almost more of a tragedy for the Russian people, because this was before the Soviet Union existed. It was still the Russian Empire at the time, and it was under the leadership of Tsar Nicholas. Russia entered the war on the side of the Allies, but by 1917, Russia actually had to quit the fight because the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution. All of a sudden, the Russian Empire goes into the ash bin of history and is by the brand new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And by the mid-20s, you have Joseph Stalin, who's running the show. And, he's now preaching the so-called virtues of all things communism. And if you look on the other side, the Weimar Republic is trying to make sense out of the chaos and devastation of the post-World War I era, which, doesn't last too long before Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party comes to power. And from the ensuing chaos on both sides of Europe really becomes a tale of two dictators. You have one maniacal dictator, Adolf Hitler, in Western Europe, and then in Eastern Europe you have Joseph Stalin, who really are two sides of the same coin. The only thing that really separates them is one is a fervent communist, and the other one just sees himself as a messiah of sorts to lift Germany out of the post-war chaos. And establish a brand new 1,000-year Reich.
Mm.
So you have a story at this point of two toughest kids on the block, and it's really only a matter of time before they start coming to blows. Neither one of them fully trusted each other, but I think of the two, Stalin had the more Machiavellian attitude towards how he saw the future of the Soviet Union, because he took a very close look at how Hitler came to power and how Hitler consolidated his grip over the German people. And he said, okay, well, he's a capitalist, he's a fascist, I'm a communist. So knowing what he's capable of, and if his actions in Austria and Czechoslovakia are any indication, he's probably going to want to spread his dominance throughout the European mainland. But if World War I was any type of a predictor, he's probably going to draw France and Great Britain into another European war. Now, the U.S. may or may not get involved, but if Hitler starts another war on mainland Europe, chances are he's going to wear himself out, and he's likely going to be on the losing end of that. And if and when that happens, the ensuing destabilization that he causes in Europe will give me a ripe opportunity to establish Soviet domination on the European mainland. So I'm going to keep my eye on this guy, and I'm going to see what he does. If ever he draws the rest of Europe, or even if he draws North America into a protracted war, well, I'm just going to play my position. I'm going to bide my time and wait for the moment is right for when I can make all of Western Europe essentially a Soviet client state. Well, Hitler, for his part, while all of this is happening, says to himself, my biggest ambition is to, one, make up for the injustice that was done to Germany at the Treaty of Versailles, and to further the cause of the Aryan race. Launches World War II by invading Poland, then he goes into Denmark and Norway and France. Then, of course, you have the fall of France, and he is almost successful in dominating all of Western Europe, if not for the bravery of the Royal Air Force in Britain and the ensuing Battle of Britain, which keeps him from getting a toehold on the entire continent. Well, even though Hitler loses in the Battle of Britain, he discards his non-aggression pact with Stalin, which he never really had any intention of abiding by anyway, and he decides that he wants to invade the Soviet Union. And in the summer of 1941, he takes a close look at what he thinks is solid gold intelligence, and he tells himself, okay, Stalin cut off his nose to spite his face. He killed a lot of his best officers during the Great Purge, and his Air Force is weak, his army is weak. Territorial size is really the only advantage that he has going for him. The Soviet people are scared, they're terrified of their own leader. So I'm sure that if I invade, I'm going to make short order of any armed resistance that Stalin mounts against me, and the Soviet people are going to see me as liberators, and I guarantee that I'm going to be in Moscow by the 1st of December. And he's also thinking to himself along the traditional lines of warfare, saying that as long as I capture the capital city, I will have ultimate victory.
Wow,
because warfare back in those days, it was kind of like capture the flag. If you capture the capital city, that's it, game over, you've won. But he doesn't count on a few things. One, he doesn't count on the fact that if you invade the Soviet Union, you better pack some winter clothes, because those winters are the most brutal anywhere. I mean, we're talking double-digit sub-zero temperatures every day for months at a time. And he also didn't count on the resolve of the Soviet people. They may have said, okay, Joseph Stalin is a brutal dictator, but by God, he's our brutal dictator, and nobody invades our country and gets away with it. One thing you really have to know about the Russian people is that they are fiercely patriotic, and if foreigners start to invade, they will fight to the last standing person, last man, woman, and child to expel the invader. By the fall of 1941, Hitler's invasion had stalled, pushed the German forces back into the heart of the fatherland.
What's interesting about what you talk about the civilians, it was something that I kept, picking up on through the book, and well written. I mean, that was Nancy and I both said, it takes us back to school about how World War II happened.
Well, I think it should be in schools.
Yeah, and you also brought in this whole other side.
I think that people would learn history way easier and remember it better with your writing style as opposed to, I'm just thinking back to textbooks I was, having to read and couldn't make my mind go there with how they were written. You know, sorry, whoever wrote those. I just feel like if it's in a story form, you remember it better than when it's written sort of almost like a recipe book, some of the textbooks on history.
So, Mike, the one thing you talk about throughout the book that Nancy and I were reading, is that you brought in civilians quite a bit. That they were really part of. They were part of like saying, "Hey, don't you're not going to invade our country," like you're just saying now too. But it's throughout the book, and this is a story you don't really see in textbooks. Like I said at the beginning, it's like, you reminded us of World War II history that, go back to school and remember that. But these are those stories you don't always get, those little nuggets, as well as women being part of the Air Force, the Red Air Force, and then going into the regiment too, the 586 Fighter Aviation Regiment. I thought that was really fascinating to see women in here, because we think about in America we have Rosie the Riveter, right? And but it was like, I wonder if that also helped spur on Rosie the Riveter, was what was going on with the Russian women being part of this. So it's interesting, just those stories in there. I think it brings it on home to people that, we always think about boom, boom, this is what happened. But no, there's all these people and women and civilians saying no. It's interesting because of Hitler too, thinking that, he could just come in and do that. And especially with the Red Air Force, because the Red Air Force weren't they kind of at their last legs at that point? And then, but they weren't really. That's what Hitler thought. But they were actually kind of reforming, kind of thing. Like they were getting stronger at that point.
Yeah, the Red Air Force had really suffered under the purges from Stalin, and he really did himself a disservice by killing off a lot of his best officers and his best pilots.
So weird.
To make matters worse for the Red Air Force, a lot of the equipment that they had was technologically inferior to planes that the Luftwaffe was fielding. Yeah, there was little question that the Luftwaffe really had the technological edge over the Red Air Force, but where the Red Air Force really established parity was how quickly they were able to adapt to the situation and how quickly they were able to mobilize a massive number of airplanes and really learn on the fly and learn under fire. Where you really see them start to shine, where you really see them start to turn the tables qualitatively, is right around 1943, because at around this time they realized that the current stable of aircraft that they have, technologically, it's behind what the Luftwaffe is putting out, but they say, okay, if we make an adjustment here and an adjustment there to the existing airplanes that we have, and if we can reverse engineer some of the captured airframes that we have from the Luftwaffe, can make our own planes that much better. And they also found out very quickly that the aerial engagements happening over the Eastern Front were happening at elevations below 20,000 feet. So they said to themselves, okay, well, we can have high altitude interceptors, which will be good to interdict bomber formations. But if we really want to establish air superiority, what we have to do is make nimble fighters that can be high-turning, low-altitude planes. And that's what eventually gave birth to the crates like the Yak-7 and LA-5 and LA-7 that really became the centerpieces of Soviet fighter aviation.
So using aircraft like this, was that cheaper, more effective than people on the ground? I mean,
well, no, it wasn't necessarily cheaper, but what the Soviets understood was that if they were going up against a multidimensional enemy like the German army, both the army and the Luftwaffe, they said, okay, well, we have to defeat the Germans on the ground and in the air.
Yeah.
They said air power alone isn't really going to win the war. And we can do it with just ground troops. But given the three-dimensional beatings that will be taken from the Luftwaffe, we really need to have an air force of our own that will keep the skies clear and will keep our troops on the ground as unmolested as possible. And that's when they really said, okay, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to mobilize as many ground formations as we can and make sure that they have top cover. And while we're doing that, we need to send our ground formations into combat with a good layer of close air support that will disrupt the enemy ground formations. And we need to have fighters that will, if not outright defeat the Luftwaffe, then at least disrupt their operations enough to where they can't impede the access of our troops who are on the ground.
Wow, I find it fascinating with the how they go and get everything together like this, and they're formulating everything. But we have to remember, like as you make a big point in the book, is that this was the largest continuous military operation in history. How long did this last? This whole war on the Eastern Front.
It was brutal. It went on from June of 1941 all the way up until May of 1945 when the Germans surrendered.
Wow. This is huge. So can we please talk about the women? Listen, the White Rose, because Nancy and I just stayed at a White Rose cabin on a farm. It's a farm stay in Spring Creek in East Tennessee, and we had your book, and we're staying in her cabin. It's the White Rose of Stalingrad. So this is amazing to me about these women firefighters. It's not firefighters, pilots. These fighters, they're fighters. It's kind of like America also still learning about the Tuskegee Airmen. It's like we didn't know. So Lydia Lilithiak. I don't want to say I can pronounce anything in Russian, but she was pretty amazing. Can you tell everybody about her?
Well, the Soviet Union was unique in the sense that among the Allies, they did not have any formal restrictions against women serving in combat. And a lot of women flocked to the Soviet recruiting stations, wanting to serve the war effort in some form or fashion. Now, unofficially, the Soviet government tried to discourage women from fighting, but if any woman wanted to fight, they did not try to stop them at all. They pretty much saw it as an opportunity, like, hey, if you can stand on your own 2 feet and you're healthy enough to be in combat, sure, we want you. So the proviso to that was that many women served in gender-segregated units, and one of the most prominent segregated units was the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, and the most decorated member of that aviation regiment was a young 21-year-old lady. Her name was Lydia Lilithiak. And she had a very short but very daring life. Her father was actually a victim of one of Stalin's purges for one reason or another, and nobody really knows why. He was deemed to be an enemy of the people, and suddenly in the late 30s, her father disappeared. Probably ended up in Siberia at one of the death camps out there. But she never lost her fervent Soviet patriotism, and by the time she was 14, she had actually enrolled in a flying club, and she had quite a few flight hours under her belt by the time World War II started. So she decided to put her flying skills to good use and become a fighter pilot in the Red Air Force. And she took to it pretty much like a duck takes to water, and was incredibly talented in the plane and outfly many of her peers, both male and female. And by the time she was 21, she had already had about 12 or 13 confirmed air-to-air kills. She was completely vicious in the air, downed the pride of the Luftwaffe, downing BF-109s or Ju-88s. She was definitely a force to be reckoned with, and because she was so good, she got away with a lot of the antics that would typically get other pilots in trouble. She would take her plane and she would frequently buzz the air control tower, which of course is not only unsafe, but it's also against the aviation regulations. She thumbed her nose at a lot of other regulations to include bleaching her hair blonde, which female pilots were not allowed to do. And
there's nothing
she
wrong
also
with that.
wore well, right. But the Soviet military, they got their hang-ups.
Well,
and she also wore a...
Could a guy bleach his hair blonde?
I don't know.
Huh.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Interesting.
I don't think anybody could, but
Okay.
it was definitely frowned upon for women.
Huh.
And she also
Funny.
wore a white and blue polka dotted scarf, which of course, was not a uniform item. And even though she was told not to wear it, she wore it anyway. In fact, there's a famous picture of her where she is sporting her white and blue scarf as part of an official portrait. She ultimately met her demise at the age of 21. This was 1943. She was shot down over the Battle of Kursk, and it's unclear to this day who it was that actually shot her down, but most records seem to agree that she was shot down by an FW-190. They didn't find her remains again for a very long time because of all the battlefield clutter that was happening down below at the Battle of Kursk. I forget how many years it was later, but it was quite a while before they actually found the remains and confirmed that these were the remains of Lydia Lilithiak.
Wow.
Wow. So on the Luftwaffe side, did I pronounce that correct? Luftwaffe, I want to say, because like a different accent here. But one of the beginning part of the book, you did a spotlight on Hermann Goering, and this guy, he was like rising up through Hitler's ranks, and then that went sour. Like, that's a crazy story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Hermann Goering, brilliant fighter pilot, brilliant aviator. Yeah, he probably knew more about military aviation than any one of his contemporaries, probably before or since. And the tragedy is that for as smart as he was and for as much of an aviation genius as he was, for lack of a better term, the man was just not a good person. Aligned himself with the Nazi ideology. He stood to be counted with all of the evil that stood for. And for the longest time, he really was seen as Hitler's handpicked successor. He was the man who made the Luftwaffe into the incredible air force that it was, and he was in many ways Hitler's right-hand man. But the relationship between him and Hitler soured very quickly towards the end of the war, not only as a function of Germany very clearly being on the losing end, but as the Allies were closing in on the fatherland, Goering came to Hitler and said, okay, well, things are falling apart. What say you give me control of the Reich and I try to stem the tide of this disaster that is happening all around us. And Hitler, egomaniac that he was, did not take kindly to that, and essentially stripped Goering of all of his responsibilities within the Reich. And not that saved Goering in the long run, because after Nazi Germany surrendered, Goering was among many of the Nazi officials who were rounded up by the Allied Commission and stood trial at Nuremberg, and was one of among the many Nazi leaders who were found guilty of war crimes. But Goering took the easy way out, got his hands on a cyanide capsule, and committed suicide before he was ultimately sent to the gallows. And the interesting footnote about Goering, and what I don't think a lot of people know, is that Goering had a daughter. His daughter was actually born during the peak of the Nazi regime, and given the age of Hermann Goering and his wife, the birth and the conception really was considered a miracle, and it was headline news throughout Nazi Germany that the chief of the Luftwaffe had a baby daughter. So the daughter herself was really just a child when her father was when her father was captured and father committed suicide. She kept a low profile for several years until the 1980s, right around the time when the Berlin Wall fell, when she did a documentary interview telling her life story, what it was like knowing that she had grown up as the child of a high-ranking Nazi official, and trying to reconcile the Hermann Goering that she knew as her daddy versus the Hermann Goering that demonstrably did all of these not so nice things while in a position of leadership within the Nazi Party.
Wow,
that's insane.
That had to be tough.
Okay, so Mike, I was saying earlier that you've written numerous books, like a gazillion of them. There's right now, everybody again, Air War on the Eastern Front out now today. You can get it. Go to Amazon or go to MikeGuardia.com.